I'm Lauren Bishop, 38 years old, and last Thursday my husband Ethan was killed in a car accident on his way home from work. 27 minutes after they pronounced him dead, I called my mother, still shaking my voice, barely holding together, and she said, "We just lit the candles, Lauren. Can it wait until tomorrow?" In the background, I heard my sister's laughter, the clinking of wine glasses, and someone singing off key. That was the moment I realized I hadn't just lost Ethan. I had lost the illusion that my family would ever show up for me. That night, while they toasted another year of Emily's life, my 10-year-old son and I curled up in Ethan's hoodie, holding on to what was left of ours. If you've ever had to grieve alone, because those closest to you chose convenience over compassion, you're not alone. Let me know where you're watching from, and subscribe to join others who understand this pain. Because sometimes healing begins with being heard. The official cause was massive thoracic trauma. That's what the doctor said. His tone was so clinical, I almost envied it. I stood there in the emergency room hallway, still wearing the scarf Ethan had given me that morning, and listened to a stranger tell me that my husband of 12 years, my partner in building a life, raising our son, and creating a company from nothing, was simply gone. It had been raining. Not the kind of rain that washes things clean, but the cold, needling kind that seeps into your skin and stays there. The kind of rain that makes the whole world feel like a bad omen. Ethan had left the house in a hurry, running late to pitch our new educational platform to an investor. We were finally turning a corner. He promised he'd pick up Miles from after-school coding class, and that he'd grab real maple syrup on the way home because we'd run out. He never liked the fake kind. "Only the good stuff for my boys," he always said. The delivery truck had skidded through a red light, hit the driver's side. Ethan never had a chance. I remember thinking how absurd it was that something as ordinary as a traffic light could break your entire world. I had called our neighbor Ellen from the hospital. She was the kind of woman who didn't ask questions, just acted. She picked up Miles, fed him dinner, let him watch old Pixar movies, and fell asleep on her couch. When I got home that night, the house felt like a ghost of itself. Ethan's shoes were still by the door. His coffee mug sat on the counter half full. On the fridge was a post-it note he'd left that morning. "You got this, LB." I didn't feel like I had anything. I sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the silence. When Ellen brought Miles home, he hugged me tightly. He didn't ask questions, just nestled into my lap, his little hand fisted in Ethan's hoodie, his breath warm against my ribs. I held him like he was the only thing anchoring me to the earth. Later that night, I called Emily. My sister. The golden one. The one my mother described as effervescent and the light of our family. She didn't answer. I left a message. Just 3 words: "He's gone, Emily." No one called back. The next morning, the streets shimmered with puddles, and the sky was that dull post-storm gray. I stood at the kitchen window holding Ethan's mug, wondering if I could do this alone. Then my phone buzzed. A message from my mother. "Thinking of you. Call when you're ready." Not "we're coming," not "we're here." Just a bland platitude wrapped in performative concern. Later that afternoon, Ellen stopped by with a casserole and a quiet presence. We sat in the backyard under a dripping awning while Miles napped. I told her about the accident. Ethan always took the longer route home because he liked the way the oaks bent over Maple Avenue. About the syrup, the shoes, the post-it. She listened without interruption. When I finally stopped talking, she touched my hand and asked, "What about your family?" I stared out at the damp yard. They had other priorities. She nodded like she already knew. 3 days later, my mother called. Not to say she was coming, but to ask if the funeral could be scheduled after Emily's Napa trip. "She's been looking forward to it for months," she said. Like that was justification. It's hard to rearrange things last minute. I didn't raise my voice, didn't cry. I just said, "Saturday. The funeral is Saturday." She sighed. "We'll do our best." That night, I sat down to write Ethan's eulogy. Miles was at the table next to me, drawing a volcano with stick figures of me, him, and Ethan smiling beside it. I watched him and thought, how do I explain this? How do I explain that grief isn't the hardest part? It's the abandonment that follows it. The cursor blinked on the screen. I stared at the empty page, trying to distill a decade of love, sacrifice, and partnership into something worthy of Ethan. Something Miles could hear one day and know who his father was. And I realized then what I was truly mourning wasn't just Ethan. It was the death of hope. Hope that the people who raised me, who watched me marry him, who held my baby at his baptism, might show up for me when I needed them most. They didn't. But I would show up for myself. And that was the beginning of everything that came next. The funeral was held on a rainy Tuesday. Not the kind of gentle rain that feels poetic, but the heavy sideways sort that makes umbrellas pointless. I wore black, not out of tradition, but because any color felt like a betrayal. Miles clung to my hand the entire time, his small fingers sticky from the juice box I forced him to sip earlier. My mother sat 2 rows behind me with Emily dressed in her lavender suit, the same one she wore to Grandma Irene's memorial. I remember because she asked me if it looked too cheerful that morning. She didn't speak during the service. Neither did Emily. They dabbed at dry eyes and exchanged polite nods with Ethan's colleagues as though they were guests at a networking event. Not once did they reach for my hand. Ellen, however, arrived alone and on time. She didn't say anything when she pulled me into a hug. She just held on a few seconds longer than necessary, and I leaned into her shoulder without shame. After the service, we walked through the cemetery mud, trying to avoid the press of umbrellas and the echoing sound of dirt hitting wood. My mother approached me just once to say, "I hope you're not planning to keep Miles out of school too long. Routine is good for children." I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I didn't have the strength to explain how some routines, like waking up and remembering your father is gone, are the kind you never recover from. That night, I found a sealed envelope tucked between Ethan's flannel shirts. It was addressed to me in his handwriting, the kind that always looked like it was leaning forward, racing towards something. I opened it slowly, heart thudding as if he might still be on the other side of the page. Inside were 2 things: a short letter and a post-it note. The letter read, "Lauren, if you're reading this, it means the unthinkable has happened. I can't protect you from the pain, but I need you to know you were never invisible to me. Not for a second. You gave me a home in a world that never felt like mine. Take care of Miles the way only you can. And take care of yourself the way I wish I had pushed you to do more. You are stronger than you think. I love you. Ethan." The post-it note just said, "Ellen has the file. Trust her." I didn't cry. Not then. I folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and tucked it into my sock drawer under my favorite sweater, the one Ethan used to call my warrior armor, because it was cozy, but made me look like I meant business. The next morning, Ellen came over with bagels in that file. It contained the living trust documents Ethan had drawn up 6 months before his death, when a friend of his had a stroke at 40. His assets, the house, the accounts, everything was placed in a trust for Miles and me. He had named me primary guardian and trustee, but the secondary Ellen. Not Emily. Not my mother. Ellen. When I asked her if she knew, she said, only that he told me if anything ever happened, I'd be the one person he trusted to back you up without question. And that was it. No ceremony, no drama. Just a quiet affirmation that somewhere someone had believed in me when my own family did not. That week the calls and texts began. My mother sent long, rambling voice messages about how families should come together during loss. Emily texted links to grief support groups and articles about resilience. None of them asked what I needed. They just prescribed what they thought I should want. And when I didn't respond, they pivoted. My mother called Ellen to check in as if I were a patient under her care. Ellen told her kindly but firmly that I was not taking visitors. Then came the brunch invitation. I found it in my inbox under the subject line, "A Chance to Heal." It was from Emily, of course, an invitation to her garden party the following weekend. "Just close family," she wrote. "A safe space for love stories and shared memories of Ethan." I stared at it for a full 10 minutes before I deleted it. There were no shared memories. Not really. They barely knew him. They barely knew me. But it was that night while washing dishes that I broke down. Not from sadness. From clarity. I wasn't angry because they had misunderstood me. I was angry because I had spent so long hoping they wouldn't. I realized I had been the one holding the door open, waiting for them to walk through with compassion. And now that Ethan was gone, that door didn't feel like a welcome anymore. It felt like a wound. I sat at the kitchen table with Miles helping him finish a worksheet his teacher had sent home. "Who's picking me up tomorrow?" he asked. "Me," I said, and he looked up. "Not Grandma." "No," I said. "Just me. From now on, it's going to be just us, until someone earns the right to be part of our circle." He didn't fully understand, but he smiled anyway. "Okay. Just us." And in that moment, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. I didn't need to justify the decision to anyone, not even to myself. The next morning, I emailed the funeral home to request a second copy of Ethan's death certificate for legal filings. Then I called a therapist and booked a consultation. I didn't need fixing, but I needed help navigating the invisible terrain I now stood on, somewhere between widow and warrior. Ellen stopped by later that afternoon. She brought a small bonsai tree with a tag that said, "Prune what no longer serves." I laughed through my nose, the first real sound of humor I'd made in weeks. "Subtle," I said. "Effective," she replied. We drank coffee on the porch, while Miles rode his bike in loops narrating his imaginary spaceship journey. "You know, Ellen said I think Ethan knew you'd need space more than support. That's why he put everything in your hands. He trusted you to build something new." I nodded, unable to speak. That evening, I walked through each room of our home with a notebook. I wasn't Marie Kondoing grief, but I was reclaiming space. I listed what stayed, what went, and what simply needed to be blessed and boxed. I paused at the family photos on the hallway wall, those curated Christmas card snapshots my mother insisted on printing each year. In none of them was Ethan centered. In most of them, neither was I. I took them down. I didn't throw them away. I just put them in the guest room closet. I wanted the walls to breathe again. That night before bed, I wrote in my journal, "They may never understand what I've lost, but I am beginning to understand what I still have, and that perhaps is the beginning of something sacred." The first thing I did was change the locks, not because I was afraid of break-ins, but because something about it felt symbolic, like drawing a line around my life. A new key, a new boundary. My mother had a spare from years ago when she used to let herself in unannounced. I didn't want that anymore. Not the visits, not the explanations, not the intrusion masked as concern. I boxed up Ethan's things gradually, carefully, not to erase him, but to make space for breathing. I kept his hoodie, the post-it notes, and his old journal, where he scribbled business ideas and grocery lists with equal importance. Miles helped. We made it a project. Each item we packed, we'd talk about. "Remember when Dad wore this to the science fair?" Miles would say, and I'd smile and nod, sometimes biting the inside of my cheek to stay composed. But I didn't cry as much anymore. Not in front of him. Not out of shame, but because I wanted to be strong without pretending. There's a difference. 2 weeks after the funeral, my mother called again. "Emily's hosting a brunch next Saturday, just family. You should come, it would be good for you." Her tone was sweetened with obligation, not warmth. I asked her, "Is it for Ethan, for Miles?" Silence. Then, "Well, it's just a chance to reconnect." I paused and said, "No, I don't think I'm interested in reconnecting right now." She sounded wounded, like I had just slammed a door in her face. But I hadn't. I'd merely declined the invitation to keep hurting myself. The next day, Ellen and I took Miles to the park. He ran across the field chasing a red frisbee a teenager tossed in his direction. Ellen handed me a thermos of coffee. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded. "Actually, yeah. I'm learning how to not apologize for needing space." Ellen smiled, that quiet kind of smile that doesn't demand more. She just said, "Took me years. You're ahead of the curve." I started journaling again. Not for insight or clarity, but to have a place where my voice didn't have to be filtered. I wrote things I never said aloud. I am not responsible for their comfort. I am not their scapegoat. I am not small. It felt strange at first, but the more I wrote, the more I started to believe it. Then came Emily's text. "We need to talk." About the house. The house. The one Ethan and I had built with his first bonus and my severance. The one we'd poured every saved dime into. Turns out my name was never added to the deed. A clerical error, Ethan had told me once, one we kept meaning to fix. But in the wake of his death, that error became leverage. Emily, always the one to step in with solutions, had talked to a lawyer. If you're not the legal owner, the estate could be disputed. Maybe we should figure out how to divide it fairly. Fairly. I stared at the message. Then I called my lawyer. That meeting changed everything. Not because I learned I had legal recourse, I did, but because it was the first time I said aloud, I'm not going to let them take anything else from me. I sent one message back to Emily: do not contact me about my home again. All correspondence will go through my attorney. No more explanations. No more hoping they'd suddenly understand my grief. No more lowering myself to keep the peace. I took Miles on a weekend trip, just the two of us. We drove up to the coast, stayed in a tiny cabin that smelled like cedar and salt. We ate pancakes for dinner, collected sea glass, and watched movies in bed. I told him stories about Ethan, not the heroic ones, just the real ones. He used to sing off-key in the shower. He once burned frozen waffles because he tried to toast them over a candle during a blackout. Miles laughed so hard he snorted. I hadn't heard that laugh in weeks. I didn't know how much I needed it. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat on the porch and looked out at the ocean. I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago, accommodating, careful, and quietly resentful. And I thought about the woman I was becoming. Still scared, still healing, but unafraid to take up space. Grief is not a straight line. It loops, it spikes, it surprises you. But it also teaches. It taught me that peace isn't the absence of pain, it's the presence of boundaries. And choosing peace sometimes looks like saying no. Sometimes it looks like changing the locks. Sometimes it looks like walking away from people who share your blood but not your heart. I went back to work 3 weeks later. Slowly. Remotely. I had to delegate most of the executive decisions, but I kept one thing: mentorship. I held Zoom calls with young women trying to build businesses while balancing caregiving, mental health, and the invisible weight of being everything to everyone. I listened. I offered advice. But mostly I reminded them, you're allowed to protect your energy. You're allowed to rewrite the rules. Miles started sleeping through the night again. He asked to move his mattress into my room. Not out of fear, he said, just because he liked the sound of my breathing. I let him. Some nights I'd wake up and see him sprawled sideways, hair stuck to his forehead, arms thrown wide. A reminder that life doesn't end with death, it adapts. The last time I saw Emily was at the bank. Pure coincidence. She walked in heels, sharp sunglasses, oversized, and stopped when she saw me. "Lauren," she said like it was a question. I nodded. "Emily." We stood in that awkward silence only siblings can create. Finally she asked, "Are you really cutting us off? Mom's worried?" I looked at her, not unkindly, just clearly. "Tell Mom I'm finally listening to myself." She blinked, taken aback. "That's dramatic." "No," I said. "That's growth." Then I turned and walked away. Not because I was angry, but because I no longer needed to stay and explain. And that was the real beginning. Not the funeral, not the letter, not even the lock change. The real beginning was the moment I realized I get to choose who has access to me. And from now on, it would be people who show up, people who stay, people like Ethan, people like Miles, people like me. It started small. A Saturday morning with no alarm. Just sunlight pushing through the curtains and the slow stretch of my limbs, not for obligation, but because they were ready. Miles tiptoed into the kitchen, barefoot, hair wild with sleep, and asked if we could make waffles, the way Dad used to burn them. I laughed, not the bitter kind, but the real kind that tugs at your stomach. "Only if you're in charge of the smoke alarm," I said, and just like that we were okay for a moment. I began rebuilding not the house but the rhythm of our days. I swapped our mismatched dinnerware for a second-hand ceramic set in ocean blue. I painted the hallway a shade called Early Dusk and put up new photos of Miles on the beach, Ethan reading on the porch, even one of Ellen and me laughing with our feet in the pool. I didn't erase the past. I just finally made space for what came after. I stopped answering texts that made me anxious. I muted the family group chat. I started a new one with just Ellen and my neighbor Maya, who brought Miles fresh baked cookies every Tuesday because her grandson lived across the country. These were my people now, not by blood, but by choice. Work shifted too. I returned to the office twice a week more by need than desire. At first I worried I'd lost the sharpness, the fire. But in my absence, clarity had grown like moss, quietly, persistently. I no longer jumped at every email or stretched myself across impossible deadlines. I said no more often. I mentored more women. I advocated for flexible hours, mental health stipends, and family leave. I didn't just return, I redefined. Miles adjusted in his own way. He started piano lessons with an old keyboard we found at a garage sale. He joined a junior robotics club and insisted I call him Commander Bishop at home. At night, he'd ask if I was okay, and I'd tell him honestly, not every day, but today I'm better than yesterday. One evening, I found a letter in Ethan's old briefcase. It was addressed to Miles. I debated whether to open it, then decided it was his, but I held it for a while, tucked it in my nightstand. Not out of fear, out of reverence. Some things arrive when we're ready, and that day wasn't yet. My mother emailed me about a family reunion Emily was planning. "You and Miles should come," she wrote. "It's time to move forward." I stared at those words for a long time. Forward. As if grief were a line you could walk away from. As if I hadn't already built 1,000 quiet steps in that direction. I didn't reply. Not because I hadn't moved forward, but because I finally had, and I wasn't going to walk backward just to make someone else feel comfortable. Growth had cost me too much to pretend. Instead, I packed a picnic, loaded Miles into the car, and drove to the same lake where Ethan had once taught him how to skip stones. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. We sat with our feet in the water, letting the silence be enough. This wasn't the life I planned, but it was the life I was learning to shape with intention, grit, and grace. I was still healing, yes, but no longer waiting. No longer asking for permission to live in color again. I was building, and every boundary, every laugh, every morning without an apology was a brick in the new foundation. It was mine. And it was enough. The invitation came in the form of a card, thick stock, cream-colored with gold-embossed lettering that read, "Emily and Thomas invite you to a celebration of family and gratitude." I stared at it for a long time, thumb tracing the edges, as if the weight of the paper could convince me the sentiment was genuine. It couldn't. Inside was a note from my mother in her loopy, practiced handwriting, "Please come." It would mean so much to everyone, especially Miles. Let's put the past behind us. They always said that, put the past behind you, as if the past was a coat you could shrug off, not a set of bones wired into your spine. I placed the card on the counter and left it there for 3 days. Then one evening, Miles found it. He read it aloud and asked, "Are we going?" I crouched down to his eye level. "Do you want to?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "I just want to see if they still have that trampoline." I smiled. Honest priorities. We went, but I set terms. We would stay no longer than 2 hours. We would leave if it felt wrong, and we would arrive together, leave together. Emily greeted us at the door with her polished smile and freshly curled hair. Her husband Thomas hovered nearby, wine glass in hand, eyes already glazed from polite small talk. My mother wore a pastel pink wrap dress and the kind of perfume that used to make me feel like a child in her shadow. But something was different this time. It wasn't them. It was me. I didn't apologize when Miles dropped a cracker on the white carpet. I didn't make excuses when I declined the wine. I didn't overcompensate. I didn't smile when I didn't feel like it. I noticed how often they talked over each other. How quickly they steered the conversation away from Ethan whenever Miles brought him up. I noticed the absence of real listening. At one point, Emily tried to corner me near the buffet. "It's really good to see you like this," she said too brightly. "So stable, like what I asked." She blinked. "You know, just functioning again." I took a slow breath. "You say that like I was broken." She laughed awkwardly. "Well, you were going through a lot. We were all worried. You never said so." She opened her mouth, then closed it. I walked away. Later, I found Miles sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the backyard where the trampoline used to be. "It's gone," he said. They turned it into a rock garden. I sat beside him. Some things don't bounce back, I said. He grinned. That's a mom joke. I nudged his shoulder. It's a good one. We left soon after. I thanked them for the invitation. I hugged my mother lightly. I told Emily goodbye without pretending. And on the ride home with Miles asleep in the back seat, I felt something shift. I had shown up not for them but for myself. I had entered their space on my terms, and I had left with my peace intact. Family wasn't who you expected to keep showing up no matter how they treated you. Family was who made room for your full self. And if that meant my family was now fewer, quieter, and found in places like Ellen's porch or Maya's Tuesday cookies, so be it. I wasn't alone. I was free. It hit me while folding laundry. The old gray cardigan Ethan always wore when working from home slid through my hands, and I didn't cry. I didn't freeze. I didn't clutch it to my chest like a lifeline. I simply folded it, placed it gently in the donation pile, and moved on to the next shirt. Letting go didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It whispered in the quiet in small rituals done without mourning. It snuck in through unclenched fists and unspoken goodbyes. Later that evening, I sat with Miles at the kitchen table while he worked on a school project about family trees. He hesitated when he got to the grandparents section. "Do I have to include them?" he asked. "Only if you want to," I said. He stared at the blank spaces for a while. Then in his careful handwriting, he wrote Ellen where my mother's name would have gone. I didn't correct him. That night after he went to bed, I opened the letter from Ethan. It was short, just a page, but every word carried weight. He talked about how proud he was of Miles, how he knew I would raise him with integrity and tenderness. He thanked me not just for loving him, but for loving myself enough to keep going. The last line read, "You don't owe anyone a version of yourself that makes them more comfortable. Live loud, love fiercely, let go." I folded it back slowly, held it to my chest, not in grief, in gratitude. The next day I updated my will. I named Ellen as Miles's guardian if anything ever happened to me. I met with my manager to discuss transitioning into a role focused on mentoring and policy development. I created a scholarship in Ethan's name for kids in STEM who'd lost a parent. I wasn't starting over. I was rewriting, retelling, restoring. The old narrative, the one where I was the quiet daughter, the accommodating sister, the grieving widow, no longer fit. I was done trying to shrink into it. Now I was the architect of a new story. And this time, the plot wasn't about loss. It was about becoming. It began with a mirror. A simple, frameless mirror I hung by the front door. For months, I'd avoided reflections, quick glances in bathroom stalls, blurred glimpses in dark windows. I didn't want to see what was missing. But that morning, running late for Miles's science fair, I caught my full self in the glass. Not just my tired eyes or the laugh lines deepening, but the whole picture, a woman who had survived who still showed up. I looked at her and smiled, not to convince, but because I meant it. That smile stayed with me longer than I expected. I wore a navy wrap dress I'd forgotten I owned, and shoes that clicked with purpose. And when I arrived at the school, arms full of a poster Miles had made entirely out of aluminum foil, I didn't shrink when the other mothers looked my way. I waved. I stood tall. I cheered loudly when Miles explained his project about renewable energy, his hands moving like windmills. Later I treated us to ice cream, not because we won anything, but because joy didn't need a prize anymore. Small rituals became celebrations. Friday pancakes with whipped cream, fresh flowers on the kitchen table, music while cooking, dancing with a spoon in one hand and a spatula in the other. I started keeping a jar of compliments notes Miles, Ellen, or Maya had said, folded neatly and kept like little victories. When days were hard, I opened them. Not to forget the pain, but to remember the balance. I went on a date. A quiet dinner with a man named Caleb who ran a bookstore and didn't ask me once about my past. We talked about stories, what they heal and what they teach. He lent me a novel I finished in 2 days. I returned it with a note that simply read, "Thank you for reminding me I still love words." At work, I accepted a nomination for a community leadership award. The old me would have declined, citing humility or time. The new me wrote the acceptance speech on a napkin between meetings. I spoke about the invisible labor of healing, about how resilience isn't always loud. It's often in showing up with open palms again and again after life has taken everything. When the applause came, I didn't look down. I didn't look away. Miles noticed the shift too. One evening he hugged me and said, "You laugh more now, not just when I make jokes. Like, for real." That night we built a fort out of sheets and watched the stars from our backyard. He pointed to the brightest one and said, "That one's Dad." I nodded. "And this one?" he asked. "That's me," I said, shining again. I didn't need a party or parade. My milestones weren't marked in confetti, but in courage. In choosing myself out loud and without apology. That was the day I learned celebration didn't have to be loud to be powerful. It just had to be mine. The day started with rain. Not a dramatic storm or a gentle drizzle, just the kind of persistent, steady rain that soaks into your bones before you even realize you're cold. I stood in front of the courthouse steps with Miles's hand in mine, the two of us sharing an umbrella too small for both our shoulders. Inside, my attorney, a calm, precise woman named Ruth, waited with a file of documents tucked neatly beneath her arm. Today was the day Ethan's will would be read. I had spent weeks preparing myself, or so I thought. But no amount of mental rehearsal could soften the truth that this moment marked the last legal tie to the man I had built a life with. Ruth led us to a small conference room, its walls lined with certificates and shelves of dusty law books. Inside were two other people, my mother with her usual tight-lipped composure and a silk scarf she always wore to funerals, even when they weren't hers, and Emily, arms crossed, dressed in an outfit that screamed practiced elegance and quiet entitlement. Neither of them looked at me. Miles sat beside me and swung his legs under the chair while I focused on my breath, counting to 4, holding, releasing. The executor began reading. Most of it was expected modest savings accounts, instructions about Ethan's personal belongings, a donation to the scholarship fund we'd discussed years ago. Then came the part I hadn't expected, though maybe I should have. Ethan had left the house solely to me and Miles, with a stipulation that if anything happened to both of us, Ellen, not my mother, would serve as guardian. The room shifted. My mother stiffened, her hand twitching at the edge of her handbag. Emily's mouth parted slightly, a sharp inhale betraying surprise before she masked it. But it was what came next that silenced even the scraping of chair legs. Ethan had included a letter that was meant to be read aloud in his own words, recorded weeks before his surgery. Ruth pressed a button on a small speaker, and suddenly there he was. "Hi. If you're hearing this, it means I didn't make it. And that's hard for me to say. But I need you all to hear this directly from me." His voice was calm, but there was a tremor beneath it. "Lauren, I know you'll be okay. Not because you're invincible, but because you're the kind of strong that bends, never breaks. And to our son, Miles, buddy, I love you more than anything. Keep building your robots. Keep asking questions. And take care of your mom, but not because she needs it, because she deserves it." There was a pause. "To those of you who didn't show up when it mattered, who turned your backs on Lauren during the hardest time of her life, I want you to know something. Family isn't just blood. Family is who shows up, who listens, who holds space when the world falls apart. That's why I chose Ellen. That's why I made the decisions I did. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. Out of love." Silence. The speaker clicked off. My mother said nothing. Emily stood, mumbled something about needing air, and left the room. Ruth handed me a folder with the signed papers. "It's all in order," she said. "Let me know if you need anything." I thanked her, took Miles' hand, and walked out into the rain. This time I didn't open the umbrella. The water felt clean, honest. In the car, Miles asked quietly, "Did Dad always know?" I nodded. He did. He saw everything. That evening I sat at the dining table, the one Ethan had built by hand the first year we moved in, and reread the will. I wasn't looking for confirmation. I just wanted to feel the finality. Then I lit a candle, not out of ceremony, but out of gratitude. For the man who believed in me, for the life we built, for the life I would continue. That night I slept without waking. No dreams, no noise, just the sound of rain steady against the roof like an old promise finally kept. Peace didn't come like a wave or a revelation. It came in choices, in moments, in the steady rhythm of choosing myself without needing a round table of approvals or explanations. It started the morning after the will was read. I brewed coffee and stood barefoot in the kitchen looking out at the garden. The rosemary Ethan planted had grown wild. I smiled, pulled on gloves, and began trimming it back, not to erase him, but to tend to what remained. Miles came downstairs sleepy-eyed, dragging a blanket, and asked if we could go to the park before school. 15 minutes, I said. Let's chase the fog. At the park, I watched him race his shadow across the dewy grass. There was no agenda. Just breathe and morning and a child who reminded me to live inside the moment. A week later, Emily emailed. She wanted to clarify a few things and suggested lunch. I agreed, not because I wanted reconciliation, but because I was done hiding from discomfort. We met at a cafe downtown. She wore a blazer too crisp for sincerity and opened with rehearsed regret. It wasn't our intention to exclude you when Dad passed. We were grieving too. I didn't respond. She filled the silence. I know you felt unsupported, but we were doing our best. My voice didn't rise. You were protecting your comfort, not supporting mine. She blinked, caught off guard. I'm not angry anymore, I continued. But I also don't owe anyone access to me just because we share blood. She sighed, offered a weak smile. So where do we go from here? I sipped my tea. Wherever honesty can survive, otherwise nowhere. Later that day, my mother called. The voicemail was brief. You've made your point. Just remember, families aren't perfect. I deleted it without listening again. Not out of spite, but because I no longer needed permission to exist outside their narrative. That evening, Ellen dropped by with lasagna and a book she thought I'd love. We ate in the garden under string lights, and Ethan once got tangled in the trellis. She didn't ask about the will. She didn't have to. Her presence had always spoken louder than their apologies. Peace continued in whispers. I planted lavender with Miles. I started journaling again, not about grief, but about possibility. I turned down a promotion that would have tripled my hours and taken me away from the afternoons with him. My boss looked surprised. You're the top candidate. I smiled. I know. But I'm also a mother. And a woman with a life I love. For the first time, those weren't conflicting truths. On a quiet Sunday, I walked the perimeter of the house and repainted the mailbox. I etched our last name in fresh white paint, Bishop. Not because I needed to assert ownership, but because I was done shrinking, done softening myself to fit into frames built by others. I wasn't angry, I was whole. Miles noticed. He began drawing more sketches of our house, our garden, and the two of us sitting under the stars. We should make a book, he said, about how families can change shape. I kissed his forehead. We already are. Peace wasn't a destination. It was a muscle I was learning to use. And that day, for the first time, I realized I didn't need anyone's permission to feel worthy. I already was. I always had been. It didn't come with fanfare or a grand announcement. It came on a Tuesday. I had just finished dropping Miles off at school. When I stopped by the farmer's market to pick up apples, the kind Ethan used to love, crisp, tart, and never too shiny, the vendor recognized me and tucked an extra one into the bag. For the boy who knows about stars, he said. I smiled, thanked him, and walked home with the weight of gratitude pressed into the crook of my arm. The house stood in morning light, shutters still damp from last night's rain garden humming with bees. I unlocked the door and stepped into quiet, a kind of quiet that didn't echo loneliness anymore. It was calm, full. I placed the apples in a bowl, opened all the windows, and let the breeze run through the rooms like laughter. I lit a candle, not for memory this time, but for presence. I played Ethan's favorite vinyl, letting the needle hiss and hum into Nina Simone. And then I sat down right there on the kitchen floor, back against the cabinet, knees pulled to my chest, and exhaled the breath I didn't know I'd been holding for months. I was home. Not because it was where Ethan and I had lived, not because it was familiar, but because I had filled it, rebuilt it, and made space for who I had become. That afternoon, Ellen and Maya came over. We spread out across the porch, drinking iced tea and folding programs for the launch of the scholarship fund in Ethan's name. Miles helped too, drawing stars on each one. So they know it's from Dad, he said. I nodded, heart warmed. The event was quiet, but full. People came who knew Ethan, who loved him, who had seen how he showed up not with grandeur, but with integrity. When I took the stage, I didn't shake. I didn't look for approval in the crowd. I simply spoke. Ethan believed in showing up for people even when it wasn't convenient. He believed in investing in those who needed someone to believe in first. This fund is not just for grades or talent, it's for resilience, for rising. The applause didn't matter. The silence after did, the kind where people are changed if only a little. That night, Miles and I cooked dinner together, pasta with too much cheese and unevenly chopped basil. We ate on the floor of the living room, surrounded by candles and soft jazz. At one point, he leaned on my shoulder and whispered, "Do you think Dad's proud?" I looked at him, at the life we'd built, at the way grief had become soil instead of cement. "I know he is," I said. Before bed, I tucked him in and lingered at the doorway, watching his chest rise and fall. Then I walked out to the garden. The rosemary had begun to bloom again. I sat on the bench, wrapped in Ethan's old flannel, and looked up. The sky was clear, stars sharp. One of them winked. That was the day I knew I was home. Not in a place, in myself. The life I live now isn't the one I once imagined, but in many ways it's stronger, deeper, and more honest. It's built on the kind of love that survives disappointment and the kind of peace that doesn't ask for permission. If you've ever been hurt by the people who were supposed to protect you, or if you've had to rebuild your life from the ashes of betrayal and loss, I want you to know you're not alone. Sometimes the most radical thing we can do is simply choose ourselves again and again. And to anyone out there who's still holding their breath, waiting for someone to see their worth, exhale. You were never invisible, you were simply surrounded by people who chose not to look. If this story spoke to you, please share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear how you found strength in your storms. And if you're on a similar path of healing and rediscovery, hit that like button and subscribe to join a community of others walking beside you. Because family isn't just who you were born to, it's who stands beside you when the sky falls. Thank you for listening to my journey. And wherever you are, I hope you find your way home too.